A bitter winter wind swept through the quiet streets before sunrise, carrying the kind of cold that settled deep into a person's bones. Most people hurried past with steaming cups of coffee tucked between gloved hands, their collars pulled high as they rushed toward warm offices and comfortable routines. But one young woman walked more slowly, her shoulders slightly hunched beneath a faded gray coat that had long since lost its ability to keep out the cold. Her name was Emma. She tightened the strap of her worn handbag and glanced at the few coins resting in her palm. She counted them once. Then she counted them again. The total never changed. It was just enough for either a bus ride to work, or a small breakfast. Not both. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that dinner the night before had been little more than a bowl of instant noodles she had split with her younger sister. She closed her hand around the coins and slipped them back into her pocket. "I can eat later," she whispered to herself with a tired smile. It wasn't the first time she'd made that promise. She started walking again, choosing the 40-minute walk over the bus. Every dollar mattered now. Rent was due in less than a week. Her father's medical bills continued to pile up on the kitchen table, each envelope more intimidating than the last. Her younger sister, Lily, was trying her best in school, pretending not to notice that the refrigerator seemed emptier every month. Emma had become very good at pretending too. Pretending she wasn't tired. Pretending she wasn't scared. Pretending everything would somehow work out. As she turned onto Maple Street, the warm smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the icy air. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes. The aroma reminded her of childhood mornings before life became so complicated, when her mother would pull fresh bread from the oven while everyone gathered around the tiny kitchen table. Those mornings had disappeared years ago, but the smell still carried their memory. She smiled sadly and continued walking. Looking inside the bakery would only make her hungrier. But just as she was about to pass, raised voices stopped her. "Oh, come on," one customer complained impatiently. "Some of us have places to be." Another sighed dramatically. "If you don't have enough money, just step aside." Emma turned toward the entrance. Near the counter stood a tiny elderly woman wearing a simple beige coat that looked almost as old as she was. Silver hair peeked out beneath a knitted hat, and her thin hands trembled slightly as she searched through an old leather purse. She emptied it carefully onto the counter. A few coins rolled across the wooden surface. The cashier counted them once before offering a sympathetic smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said gently. "You're still $3 short." The elderly woman looked down at the coins as if hoping another one might magically appear. "I'm certain I had enough," she murmured softly. "You don't," snapped the impatient man standing behind her. "Can someone please move this along?" Several customers nodded in agreement. The old woman quickly began gathering her scattered coins. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassment filling her voice. "I didn't mean to hold everyone up." She reached toward the loaf of bread one last time before quietly pushing it back across the counter. "It's all right," she said with forced composure. "Perhaps another day." Emma watched the scene unfold. She could have kept walking. She probably should have. Those last few dollars represented her ride home after work. Without them, she would have another long walk through the freezing night. Worse still, she had planned to use what little remained to buy something inexpensive for dinner. No one would blame her for protecting what little she had. After all, she wasn't responsible for everyone else's problems. But as the elderly woman slowly turned toward the door, trying to hide the disappointment in her eyes, Emma felt something tighten inside her chest. She remembered her own grandmother. Proud. Gentle. Always pretending she was fine even when she wasn't. Without giving herself time to think, Emma stepped forward. "I'll pay for it." The bakery fell unexpectedly quiet. The cashier looked at her. "So, you'd like to cover it?" Emma nodded. "Yes." She reached into her coat pocket and slowly placed every remaining coin she had onto the counter. The metallic clinking sounded louder than it should have. The cashier counted the money carefully before looking up. "It covers the bread exactly." Emma smiled. "Then that's all that matters." The impatient customer shook his head. "You can't be serious. You're spending your own money on a stranger." Emma simply shrugged. "She's hungry." The man rolled his eyes. "People are too soft these days." He grabbed his coffee and stormed out without another word. Emma ignored him. The cashier wrapped the warm loaf in brown paper and handed it to the elderly woman. For several seconds, the older woman simply stared at it. Then her eyes slowly filled with tears. She turned toward Emma. "My dear." Her voice trembled. "You didn't have to do this." Emma smiled gently. "I know." The elderly woman looked at her for a long moment, almost as though she were trying to remember every detail of her face. Not her clothes. Not her appearance. Her kindness. "What is your name?" she asked quietly. "Emma." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Emma." She repeated the name with surprising warmth. "I hope life is as kind to you as you've been to me today." Emma laughed softly. "I think life and I are still negotiating." The elderly woman smiled at that. It was a knowing smile. The kind carried by someone who had lived through far more than she ever spoke about. She accepted the bread carefully, holding it close against her chest as though it were something priceless. Then she reached out and gently squeezed Emma's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her touch felt comforting. Before turning toward the door, she looked back one final time. Kindness always finds its way home. The words were spoken so softly they almost disappeared beneath the ringing of the bakery's doorbell as she stepped outside. Emma stood there for a moment, watching the elderly woman disappear into the snowy morning. She didn't know why those words lingered in her mind. She certainly didn't know why that simple loaf of bread suddenly felt much more important than the money she'd just given away. All she knew was that she was now completely broke. With a deep breath,
Then she pulled her
smiled
thin coat
to herself
tighter,
anyway, stepped back into the freezing morning, and began the long walk to work, completely unaware that the small act of kindness she had just performed would soon change her life in ways she could never have imagined. By the time Emma reached the restaurant, the warmth inside felt almost unreal against the freezing air she had walked through. She slipped off her faded coat, tied on her apron, and quickly tucked loose strands of brown hair behind her ears before the morning rush arrived. She had barely clocked in when a sharp voice echoed across the dining room. "Emma." She turned immediately. Her manager, Mr. Collins, was already glaring at her from behind the register. "Table 6 has been waiting 3 minutes. Around here, that's considered forever." "I'm sorry," Emma replied. "I'll take care of them." "Sorry doesn't pay the bills." He walked away before she could answer. Emma simply nodded to herself. She had learned long ago that arguing only made difficult days even longer. Within minutes, the restaurant was overflowing, coffee cups clattered against saucers. Orders flew into the kitchen faster than the cooks could prepare them. Customers waved impatiently for refills while phones rang non-stop with takeout requests. Emma moved from one table to another with practiced grace. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" "I'll bring that right away." Every smile she offered was genuine, even if exhaustion hid behind it. Most customers never noticed. One businessman barely looked up from his laptop as she served breakfast. "This coffee is cold." "I'm sorry. I'll bring you a fresh one." When she returned less than a minute later, he took a single sip. "Still not hot enough." She apologized again. The coffee was steaming. It wasn't really about the coffee. It rarely was. At another table, 2 women whispered loudly enough for Emma to hear. "She looks exhausted. Maybe she should find another job." Emma smiled politely as she refilled their water glasses. "Can I bring you anything else?" One of them didn't even acknowledge her. She had become invisible to people like them, not unwanted, not hated, simply unseen. Around noon, a young mother entered carrying a little boy no older than 5. The child rubbed tears from his eyes, his tiny face red from crying. Emma knelt beside him while handing out children's menus. "That must be a very important tear." The little boy sniffled. "I dropped my dinosaur." "Oh no." She widened her eyes dramatically. Was it one of the brave dinosaurs or one of the silly ones? He hesitated. "The brave one. Then I think he's probably hiding somewhere, waiting for a rescue mission." The boy looked around hopefully. A few minutes later, Emma spotted the small green toy beneath a nearby booth. She picked it up carefully and walked back with exaggerated seriousness. "I have good news." The child's eyes grew wide. The brave dinosaur completed his mission. She handed it to him, his face lit up with a smile so bright it seemed to erase every tear. His mother laughed softly. "I don't know how to thank you." Emma smiled. Seeing him smile is enough. As they left, the grateful mother quietly slipped a $20 bill beneath the coffee cup. Emma noticed it while clearing the table. She hurried outside before they reached their car. "Excuse me." The woman turned. "I think you left this." "No," she said gently. "It's for you." Emma shook her head. "You've already paid your bill. You earned it." Emma smiled apologetically. "I only found a dinosaur. You gave my son a reason to laugh." Emma carefully folded the bill and placed it back into the woman's hand. "Then let him be the reward." The mother stared at her in disbelief before finally nodding. "There aren't many people like you anymore." Emma laughed quietly. "I think there are." She glanced toward the busy sidewalk. "They're just usually too busy helping someone," Tobe noticed. Back inside, the afternoon passed no more gently than the morning. Orders piled up, the dishwasher broke. One server called in sick, everyone else's workload doubled. By evening, Emma's feet ached so badly that every step felt heavier than the last. Still, whenever another table needed help, she was already walking toward them before anyone asked. As the dinner rush finally faded, the kitchen staff began throwing away leftover bread and soup that couldn't be served the next day. Emma looked at the untouched food. "Can I take what's left?" One cook shrugged. "Better than the trash." She carefully packed several containers into a paper bag. Outside behind the restaurant, 3 stray dogs were already waiting, their tails wagged the moment they saw her. "You remembered." Emma laughed softly as she knelt beside them. "I couldn't let you go to bed hungry." She divided the food equally, making sure the smallest dog wasn't pushed away by the larger two. Only after every animal had eaten did she close the empty containers. She never noticed that someone across the street had quietly stopped walking. An elderly woman stood beside a bus stop, watching from a distance. It was the same woman from the bakery. She said nothing, she simply observed. Her expression wasn't one of surprise. It was one of quiet thought. A passing taxi slowed beside her. The driver leaned out. "Need a ride, ma'am?" She smiled politely. "No, thank you." Her eyes never left Emma. Then, almost silently, she continued walking until she disappeared into the evening crowd. Emma never realized she had been seen. She was too busy checking the time. She was already late getting home. The apartment building greeted her with flickering hallway lights and peeling paint that never seemed to get repaired. As she opened the front door, her younger sister Lily rushed over. "You're home." Emma hugged her tightly. "How was school?" "I got an A on my science project." "I knew you would." Lily grinned proudly before lowering her voice. "Dad had another bad coughing spell." Emma's smile faded. She walked quietly toward the bedroom. Her father sat near the window wrapped in an old blanket, trying to hide another cough behind his hand. "You should be resting," Emma said. "I've rested enough." He attempted a smile. "How was work?" "The usual." She never mentioned the rude customers, she never mentioned the aching feet, she certainly didn't mention spending her last money on someone else's bread. Instead, she unpacked the leftover soup from the restaurant. "Dinner is served." Lily clapped happily. "It smells amazing." Her father looked at the food before looking back at Emma. "You didn't skip lunch again, did you?" Emma hesitated for only a heartbeat. I ate at work. It was a small lie. One she had told many times before. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep and her father was finally resting peacefully, Emma sat alone at the tiny kitchen table. The stack of unpaid bills waited exactly where she had left them: rent, medicine, electricity. Each envelope demanded money she didn't have. She sighed quietly and reached for a notebook, carefully calculating next week's expenses. The numbers refused to cooperate. No matter how many times she added them together, there was never enough. For a brief moment, doubt crept into her mind. Had she been foolish this morning? Should she have kept those last few dollars? Would anyone have blamed her? She closed the notebook, then she remembered the elderly woman's grateful smile. Somehow, that memory felt worth far more than $3. Far across the city, inside a car that blended easily into evening traffic, the same elderly woman sat quietly beside the window. On her lap rested a small notebook. She slowly wrote one name across an otherwise empty page: Emma. She looked at the name for several long seconds before gently closing the notebook. Outside, city lights reflected across the glass as though hiding countless stories behind every window, and for reasons still unknown, one ordinary waitress had suddenly become the story she seemed most interested in following. 3 mornings passed, and life offered Emma no sign that anything had changed. The bills still waited on the kitchen table, her father's cough still echoed through the apartment before sunrise. Lily still kissed her sister on the cheek every morning and insisted everything at school was fine, even though Emma knew she had quietly stopped asking for things other children took for granted, and Emma still walked to work with the same determination she carried every day. If the elderly woman ever crossed her mind, it was only as a pleasant memory. She hoped the woman had enjoyed the bread. Nothing more. By Friday afternoon, the restaurant had finally entered one of its rare quiet moments. Emma was wiping down empty tables when her phone vibrated inside her apron pocket. She almost ignored it. Unknown number, probably another telemarketing call. It rang again. She sighed and answered. Hello. A calm, professional woman's voice greeted her. Good afternoon. May I speak with Miss Emma Carter? This is Emma. My name is Rebecca Hughes. I'm calling on behalf of Ashford Global Enterprises. Emma frowned. I'm sorry, who? Ashford Global Enterprises. The name sounded familiar, very familiar. She had seen it on television countless times: luxury hotels, resorts, international charities, real estate, technology investments. It was one of the largest corporations in the country. I'm afraid you've got the wrong person, Emma said politely. We're looking for Emma Carter, currently employed at Riverside Family Restaurant. Emma blinked. Yes. Wonderful. Rebecca continued as though everything were perfectly ordinary. We would like to invite you to interview for a position within our hospitality leadership division next Monday morning. Emma looked around the restaurant, expecting someone to jump out laughing. This is a prank, isn't it? No, Miss Carter. I've never applied to your company. We're aware of that. Then, how did you get my name? There was a brief pause. You've come highly recommended. Emma laughed awkwardly. I think you're confusing me with someone else. We're not. But I don't have a college degree. That won't be a problem. I've only worked in small restaurants. We're aware of your experience. Emma stared at the floor. Nothing about this conversation made sense. I don't think I'm qualified. Rebecca's answer came without hesitation. Qualifications can be discussed during the interview. Emma hesitated. And if I say no? That is entirely your choice. There was something sincere about the woman's tone. No pressure. No sales pitch, only certainty, Rebecca continued. If you decide to attend, a car will be waiting outside your apartment at 8 o'clock Monday morning. Emma almost laughed again. A car? Yes. I'm sorry, but I usually walk. I know. Those two words lingered in Emma's mind. Before she could ask another question, the woman spoke once more. We hope to meet you, Miss Carter. The call ended. Emma lowered the phone slowly. For several seconds she simply stood there. Everything all right? Emma looked up to find her coworker Maria carrying a tray of clean glasses. I think. Emma said uncertainly, I just got invited to interview at Ashford Global. Maria burst into laughter. Very funny. I'm serious. Maria stopped laughing. Wait, seriously? Emma nodded. They said someone recommended me. Maria's eyebrows rose. Who do you know that works there? No one. Mr. Collins overheard the conversation as he walked past. Ashford Global. Emma nodded. They called a few minutes ago. He folded his arms skeptically. Be careful. You think it's fake? I think companies that size don't call waitresses out of nowhere. His words stung more than Emma wanted to admit, not because they were cruel, because they sounded logical. That evening, she searched the company online using the old laptop she shared with Lily. Everything matched: the phone number, the email confirmation that had arrived minutes after the call, the office address. Nothing appeared suspicious. Still, why her? She barely slept that night. The same question circled endlessly through her mind. Monday arrived faster than expected. At exactly 8 o'clock, a black luxury sedan stopped outside her apartment building. Several neighbors immediately peeked through their curtains. Emma almost wished it hadn't come. She checked the address again. The driver stepped out and politely opened the rear door. Miss Carter? She nodded cautiously. I'm David. He smiled warmly. I'm here to take you to Ashford Global. The drive across the city felt surreal. The neighborhoods gradually changed. Old apartment buildings gave way to towering glass skyscrapers, simple cafes became elegant restaurants, the streets themselves somehow seemed quieter, cleaner, more expensive. When the car finally stopped, Emma looked up. The Ashford Global headquarters rose into the clouds like something from another world. Its enormous glass walls reflected the morning sunlight so brightly she had to shield her eyes. Employees wearing tailored suits moved confidently through the revolving doors. Emma looked down at her own modest navy blue dress. She had borrowed it from Maria. It fit well enough, but standing here, she suddenly felt like a child pretending to belong among adults. You'll do just fine, the driver said, noticing her hesitation. I don't think they realize who they invited. He smiled mysteriously. I think they know exactly who they invited. Before Emma could ask what he meant, he closed the car door and drove away. Inside, the lobby was breathtaking. Marble floors stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, fresh flowers filled the air with a subtle fragrance. A grand piano rested near the reception area where someone quietly played soft music. Emma had never imagined an office could look like this. The receptionist greeted her with a welcoming smile. Miss Carter? Yes. We've been expecting you. Of course they had. Still, hearing the words made her heart race. She was escorted into a conference room larger than her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Moments later, 5 executives entered. Each greeted her politely before taking a seat. No one seemed rushed. No one seemed intimidating. The oldest executive smiled. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for inviting me. He opened a folder but barely glanced at it. Let's begin with something simple. Emma nodded nervously. What does excellent hospitality mean to you? She expected questions about experience, training, customer service. Instead, they waited quietly for her answer. Emma thought for a moment. I think hospitality begins before someone asks for help. Several executives exchanged subtle glances. Another leaned forward. If no one ever thanked you for helping others, would you still help them? Emma looked surprised. I think so. Why? Because whether someone says thank you doesn't change whether they needed help. The room grew strangely quiet. A woman seated near the end of the table asked the next question. Have you ever made a decision that made your own life harder, simply because it was the right thing to do? Emma smiled faintly. I suppose everyone has. Can you give us an example? Emma searched her memory. There were many: returning extra change when customers accidentally overpaid, working double shifts without complaint when coworkers became sick, giving away food she could have eaten herself. Yet somehow, the bread never entered her mind. She simply answered, I've learned that difficult choices usually tell us who we really are. Another executive asked, what would you do if no one was watching? Emma looked puzzled. I don't understand. He smiled. Exactly. She laughed softly. I suppose I'd behave the same way. The questions continued. Not one asked about resumes, not one asked about business strategy, not one asked how many years she had worked in restaurants. Instead, they asked about honesty, forgiveness, failure, family, trust, responsibility. Each question felt less like an interview, and more like someone quietly searching for the truth hidden inside a person. Emma answered as honestly as she could, though she remained completely confused. When the final question ended, the executives stood together. The oldest smiled warmly. Thank you, Miss Carter. That's it? For now. She blinked. For now. He nodded. We'd like you to wait in our executive lounge while the board reaches its final decision. Emma frowned. The board? Yes. She looked around the nearly empty conference room, unable to shake the growing feeling that something much larger was unfolding around her, but what it was, she had absolutely no idea. Emma sat alone in the executive lounge, trying not to look as nervous as she felt. The room was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Soft leather chairs overlooked the city through enormous windows. Fresh orchids rested on polished tables. A quiet fireplace flickered against a marble wall, taking away the chill of the winter morning. A receptionist had offered her coffee. She politely declined, not because she didn't want it, because she wasn't sure whether it was complimentary. Old habits were difficult to silence. She folded her hands together and stared at the skyline beyond the glass. What was taking so long? Was this really an interview? Or had the company somehow discovered they had invited the wrong Emma Carter? Every passing minute seemed to make that possibility more believable. Just beyond the closed doors of the executive boardroom, however, an entirely different conversation was unfolding. A man in his mid-40s stood beside the windows with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to carrying enormous responsibility. His tailored charcoal suit was flawless, but the exhaustion in his eyes could not be hidden behind expensive fabric. His name was Daniel Ashford, Chief Executive Officer of Ashford Global Enterprises. Forbes magazine had once called him one of the most influential business leaders in the world. Today, none of those titles seemed important. He looked toward the elderly woman sitting calmly at the opposite end of the room. Mother, his voice carried equal parts affection and concern. Are you absolutely certain? The elderly woman smiled gently as she folded her gloves onto the table. I've never been more certain. The board members remained silent. Most of them had learned long ago that when Eleanor Ashford spoke with that kind of quiet confidence, she rarely needed convincing. Daniel sighed. You've only met her once. Eleanor looked at her son. No. She shook her head softly. I've watched her much longer than that. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You've been observing her? For several days. A faint smile appeared on Eleanor's face. And every day she unknowingly answered another question. One executive leaned forward. The restaurant? Eleanor nodded. The restaurant. Another executive opened a folder filled with neatly organized notes. Everything your team reported matches your own observations. Daniel looked down at the documents. Inside were photographs, short reports, times, locations, nothing invasive, nothing illegal, only records of ordinary acts that no one had expected anyone to notice: sharing food with stray animals, returning money left behind by customers, helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries upstairs, comforting a frightened child without expecting anything in return. Daniel closed the folder slowly. So it wasn't just the bakery. No. His mother smiled. The bakery simply confirmed what I already suspected. She looked toward the boardroom doors. Compassion is difficult to fake. For a moment, silence settled over the room. Then Eleanor's thoughts drifted backward, not to the bakery. Many mornings before it, months earlier, she had stood inside another cafe wearing the same modest clothes. A businessman wearing a watch worth more than most homes had brushed past her without even pretending to notice when she struggled to open the heavy entrance door. Another day, she had intentionally dropped several grocery bags outside an upscale shopping district. Designer handbags, luxury suits, expensive cars. Dozens of people passed, Some glanced briefly in her direction before looking away, others simply stepped around her as though inconvenience itself were contagious. One young influencer had even smiled into her phone while recording a motivational speech about kindness. She never stopped walking. Eleanor had watched the recording later online. Millions of people applauded the message. None knew its author had ignored an elderly woman moments before pressing record. Another memory surfaced that a wealthy restaurant owner had proudly donated thousands of dollars to charity while photographers surrounded him. Less than an hour later, Eleanor quietly entered one of his restaurants dressed exactly as she had been at the bakery. When she couldn't afford a meal, the same man who had posed beside oversized donation checks ordered a waiter to remove her because she was bad for business. The applause had ended. So had his generosity. Experience had taught Eleanor something painful. Many people loved being seen as kind, far fewer chose kindness when no audience existed. She hadn't lost faith in humanity, she had simply stopped believing appearances. Daniel interrupted her thoughts. When father built this company, he always said character mattered more than talent. Eleanor's eyes softened. He was right. Daniel walked toward the portrait hanging above the fireplace that it showed his late father smiling beside the company's very first hotel, built decades before Ashford Global became an international empire. We've spent the last year searching for someone to help lead the foundation. His voice grew quieter. Every resume is impressive. He looked back toward his mother. But somehow every interview feels rehearsed. One executive nodded in agreement. They all know the right answers. Exactly, Daniel replied. They've studied leadership books. They've hired image consultants. They know when to smile. He sighed. But I don't know who they are when nobody's watching. A warm smile slowly crossed Eleanor's face. I do. The room became still again. She remembered the freezing morning outside the bakery with remarkable clarity. She hadn't planned to buy bread, she had deliberately carried too little money, not because she enjoyed testing people, because she had learned something important over the years. Need reveals character faster than comfort ever can. That morning dozens of people had witnessed a simple choice. Most had seen an inconvenience. One young waitress had seen a hungry human being. Emma hadn't looked around first, she hadn't asked whether cameras were recording, she hadn't wondered if helping would benefit her, she simply acted, and she had done so while quietly sacrificing the last money she possessed. Not abundance, sacrifice. There was an enormous difference. Eleanor smiled to herself. Many generous people gave from what remained after their own needs were satisfied. Emma had given before her own needs were met. That could not be taught in a classroom. One of the directors finally asked the question. Everyone else had been wondering. Mrs. Ashford, what if she's simply a kind waitress? Eleanor looked at him. And? He hesitated. We're discussing leadership of a multimillion-dollar charitable foundation. She nodded. I know. Shouldn't experience come first? Instead of answering immediately, Eleanor asked a question of her own. If someone can be trusted with $3 they desperately need, she paused thoughtfully. Why would you assume they cannot be trusted with $3 million intended to help others? No one answered. No one needed to. Her point settled over the room with quiet force. Daniel slowly smiled. You already made your decision before today's interview, didn't you? His mother laughed softly. No. She looked toward the lounge where Emma still waited, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding around her. Today's interview wasn't for me. It was for you. Daniel frowned. For me. So you could see with your own eyes what I saw. He thought back over every answer Emma had given, not polished, not rehearsed, not designed to impress, simply honest. She hadn't once tried to become the person she thought the interviewers wanted, she had remained herself, and somehow, that had been exactly what they were searching for. Daniel glanced toward the closed boardroom doors, then toward the hallway leading to the executive lounge. A quiet smile formed across his face. So, he said almost to himself. She still has no idea who you are. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with gentle amusement. Not the slightest. Daniel chuckled. I wonder what her face will look like when she finds out. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. I don't. She looked toward the door with the calm certainty of someone who had waited a lifetime to meet the right person. I already know. Outside in the executive lounge, Emma nervously straightened the sleeves of her borrowed dress, still believing she was waiting for the outcome of an ordinary interview. She had no idea that the greatest mystery of the past week had finally been solved, but an even greater revelation was only moments away. The wait felt endless. Emma had lost track of how many times she glanced at the elegant clock hanging above the fireplace in the executive lounge. Every minute stretched longer than the last, and with each passing second she became more convinced that someone would soon step through the door to apologize for an unfortunate mistake. Perhaps another Emma Carter had been the real candidate all along. She quietly rehearsed what she would say if that happened. It's all right. I understand. Thank you for your time. The words sounded disappointing even inside her own head. Just then, the door opened. The same receptionist smiled warmly. Miss Carter. Emma stood immediately. Mr. Daniel Ashford would like to meet with you personally. Emma blinked. The CEO. Yes. For a brief moment, she wondered whether her knees had forgotten how to work. She followed the receptionist through a long hallway lined with photographs showing hospitals, schools, shelters, and community projects funded by the company over several decades. Something surprised her. For a corporation famous for luxury hotels and billion-dollar investments, the walls celebrated people rather than buildings, children receiving books, doctors treating patients, volunteers planting trees, families receiving the keys to new homes. She found herself slowing down to look. The receptionist noticed. Mr. Ashford insisted these be displayed instead of awards. Emma smiled faintly. I like that. A moment later, they stopped before a pair of tall wooden doors. The receptionist knocked once. Come in. Emma stepped inside. The office was impressive, but not in the way she expected. There were no golden decorations or oversized displays of wealth. Instead, bookshelves covered one wall. Family photographs occupied another. A small wooden chessboard rested beside the window. Halfway through an unfinished game, Daniel Ashford stood as she entered. He extended his hand with an easy smile. Miss Carter. She shook it carefully. It's an honor to meet you, sir. The honor may be mine. The unexpected response caught her off guard. He gestured toward two comfortable chairs beside the fireplace. Would you like some tea? Water is fine. He poured it himself rather than asking an assistant. That small gesture somehow made the room feel less intimidating. For several moments neither of them spoke. Daniel seemed perfectly comfortable with the silence. Emma was not. Finally he smiled. I've read your interview. I hope I answered everything correctly. He chuckled softly. There weren't any correct answers. She frowned. There weren't? No. He leaned back slightly. There were only honest ones. Emma wasn't sure what to say. Daniel studied her expression for a moment before asking, Tell me about your family. The question sounded so personal that she hesitated. My father has been ill for almost 2 years. What happened? He worked construction most of his life. She looked down at her hands. There was an accident. Daniel nodded quietly. And your mother? Emma's smile faded. We lost her when Lily was little. I'm sorry. So were we. He allowed a respectful silence before speaking again. You became responsible for your family very young. I didn't really become responsible. She smiled gently. I simply became available. Daniel noticed the difference. You don't see it as a sacrifice? Emma thought for a moment. When people you love need you, it doesn't feel like sacrificing. It feels like choosing. He nodded thoughtfully. Another quiet note settled into his mind, not because her answer sounded impressive, because it sounded lived. He reached into a folder beside his chair. I'd like your opinion on something. Emma looked surprised. My opinion? He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It described a fictional situation that a hotel manager had accidentally overbooked several luxury suites. Only one room remained. One guest was an internationally famous celebrity, the other was an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. "Who receives the room?" Daniel asked. Emma read the page twice. "May I ask a question?" "Of course." "Which reservation came first?" Daniel smiled almost imperceptibly. "The elderly couple." "Then it's their room." "The celebrity threatens terrible publicity." "I'm sorry to hear that. The company could lose millions." Emma looked up. "So?" Daniel folded his arms. "So, would you change your decision?" She shook her head. "If promises only matter when they're convenient, they aren't really promises." Daniel smiled but said nothing. That he simply made another small note. A few minutes later, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. "I'm sorry." He stood. "I need to answer this." As he walked toward the window, Emma remained seated. A moment later she noticed something on the carpet beside his chair. A thick leather wallet. It must have slipped from his pocket. She picked it up. For a split second, curiosity whispered inside her mind. The wallet looked expensive, very expensive. She could feel its weight. It clearly contained cash. More money than she had probably held in years. No one was looking. Daniel still faced the window, speaking quietly into his phone. She never opened it. Instead, she walked over. "I think this belongs to you." He turned. His eyes dropped to the wallet, then back to her. A warm smile crossed his face. "I wondered how long it would take." Emma looked confused. "You knew?" "I noticed it fall." "You left it there on purpose?" "I wanted to see what would happen." Emma laughed awkwardly. "Most people don't test strangers with wallets." "No." He accepted it gratefully. "Most people don't." He placed it back inside his jacket without counting a single bill. "You didn't even check if everything was still inside," Emma said. "I didn't need to." She looked genuinely puzzled. "You trust people that easily?" He smiled. "I trust evidence." "What evidence?" "You brought it back before I even knew it was missing." Emma wasn't sure whether she should feel complimented or slightly uncomfortable. Daniel changed the subject. "What does leadership mean to you?" She expected another business question. Instead, it sounded almost philosophical. "I don't think leadership is about being first." He leaned forward with interest. "What is it about?" "Being the person others don't have to fear following." His expression softened. "And if you fail?" "I apologize." "And then?" "I try again." "What if people don't forgive you?" Emma looked toward the window for a moment. "Then I have to live in a way that earns their trust again." Daniel remained silent. He had interviewed politicians, military officers, executives from international corporations, graduates from the finest universities in the world. Many spoke brilliantly, few answered as simply as this young waitress. There was no performance. No carefully constructed image, only quiet sincerity. At that moment, an assistant knocked gently before entering. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt." Daniel nodded. "What is it?" "The finance department just informed us that a vendor accidentally sent an invoice for $28,000 less than the actual amount." The assistant looked toward Emma apologetically. "They haven't noticed yet." Daniel glanced at Emma. "What would you do?" She blinked. "Me?" "Yes. The mistake benefits our company." "It does. And they may never discover it." Emma answered almost immediately. "Then we should tell them." The assistant asked, "Even if the contract allows us to remain silent?" Emma looked surprised. "Someone else's mistake doesn't suddenly become our money." Daniel smiled again. "The correction has already been sent." The assistant nodded before quietly leaving. Emma looked at him. That was another test. Daniel didn't deny it. "I'm beginning to think this interview has very little to do with hospitality." For the first time since they met, Daniel laughed openly. "You may be right." Before Emma could ask what he meant, he stood and walked toward the fireplace. For a long moment, he looked into the dancing flames before speaking again. "Miss Carter, his voice carried a warmth that had been absent until now. "There's one more person I'd like you to meet before today is over." Emma frowned slightly. "Another interviewer?" Daniel slowly turned toward her. A knowing smile appeared on his face. "No." His answer was calm. "I think it's someone you've already met." Emma searched her memory, confused. Before she could ask another question, the office door quietly began to open, and the heartbeat of every unanswered question suddenly seemed ready to find its answer. The office door opened slowly. Emma turned toward it without giving the moment much thought, then she froze. For a second, she questioned her own memory. Standing quietly in the doorway was the elderly woman from the bakery. She wore the same gentle smile Emma remembered, though today her simple beige coat had been replaced with an elegant navy suit. A delicate pearl necklace rested around her neck, and her silver hair had been neatly arranged. She looked exactly like herself, and completely different at the same time. Emma's face brightened with surprise. "Oh," she smiled warmly. "It's you." The elderly woman smiled back. "It is." Emma laughed softly, relieved to see a familiar face in such an unfamiliar place. "I didn't know you worked here." Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment, almost hiding his smile. The elderly woman glanced toward him before looking back at Emma. "No, my dear." She stepped farther into the room. "I don't work here." Emma looked confused. "I'm sorry. I just assumed." Daniel walked toward the elderly woman and gently offered his arm. She accepted it with effortless familiarity. Only then did he speak. "Emma," his voice was calm. "I'd like you to meet my mother." The room became perfectly silent. Emma blinked once, then again. She looked from Daniel to the elderly woman, and back again. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Daniel smiled gently. "This is Eleanor Ashford." Emma felt as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. Ashford, the name echoed inside her mind. Ashford Global, Daniel Ashford, Eleanor Ashford. The pieces finally began falling into place. Her eyes widened. "No," she whispered almost to herself. "It can't be." The elderly woman walked closer until she stood only a few feet away. "I'm afraid it can." Emma instinctively took a small step backward. "You?" She looked at Eleanor in disbelief. "The bakery," Eleanor nodded. "Yes." "The bread," another nod. Emma's voice trembled. "But, you didn't have enough money." "I didn't." "You were alone." "I was." "You." Emma stopped. Nothing made sense anymore. Daniel motioned toward the chairs. "Please. I think all of us should sit." Emma lowered herself into the chair almost automatically, still unable to take her eyes off Eleanor. Her mind replayed the entire morning at the bakery, the trembling hands, the worn purse, the embarrassed smile, the $3 missing. Every detail had been real. So why was she here? Daniel sat across from her while Eleanor settled beside him. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. "Emma, I owe you an explanation." She nodded slowly. "I would appreciate one." He smiled kindly. "I imagine you would." Daniel folded his hands together. "My mother has spent the last year visiting different parts of the city without revealing who she is." Emma looked at Eleanor. "But, why?" Eleanor answered herself. "Because people behave differently when they believe no one important is watching." Emma listened without interrupting. "I've met hundreds of people." Eleanor continued. "Business owners. Executives. Politicians. Students. Retirees. People with almost nothing, and people who have more than they could spend in 10 lifetimes." She smiled sadly. "I wasn't searching for generosity. I was searching for sincerity." Emma frowned. "I don't understand." Daniel reached toward a remote resting on the coffee table. A large television screen mounted on the wall quietly came to life. A paused security video appeared. Emma recognized it immediately. The bakery. Her heart skipped. The recording began. There she was, walking inside after hearing impatient voices, watching the elderly woman search her purse, seeing the customers complain, stepping forward. Placing her last coins onto the counter, the room remained silent except for the soft sounds captured by the camera. Emma watched herself smile, watched herself hand over everything she had, watched the elderly woman receive the bread, then came the word she remembered so clearly. Kindness always finds its way home. The video stopped. Emma stared at the screen. She barely found her voice. You saw everything. Daniel nodded. My mother told me about that morning. Emma looked toward Eleanor. You knew I didn't have much money. I suspected. You still accepted it. Eleanor's eyes filled with gentle emotion. My dear, if I had refused your kindness, I would have rejected your heart. Emma looked down at her hands. I only bought a loaf of bread. No. Daniel said quietly. You revealed who you are. Emma looked back up that he continued. Our company has spent months searching for someone to help lead the expansion of our charitable hospitality foundation. Emma almost laughed in disbelief. You interviewed me, because I bought bread? Not because you bought bread. Daniel corrected gently. Because of everything that purchase revealed. He stood and slowly walked toward the window overlooking the city. Do you know how many impressive applications we received? Emma shook her head. Thousands. He turned back toward her. People with extraordinary resumes. International degrees. Decades of executive experience. Perfect interviews. He paused. But every answer sounded prepared. His voice softened. You never prepared. You simply answered. Emma shook her head slightly. I still don't understand why me. Daniel smiled. My mother didn't stop watching after the bakery. Emma looked surprised. Eleanor reached into a leather folder resting beside her chair. She carefully removed several photographs, not secret surveillance, simply ordinary moments captured in public places. Emma feeding the stray dogs behind the restaurant, Emma returning the forgotten tip, Emma helping an elderly tenant carry groceries, Emma sitting beside a frightened child until his parents arrived. Emma looked at each photograph with growing embarrassment. I didn't know anyone was watching. Exactly. Eleanor replied softly. That is why they matter. Tears slowly gathered in Emma's eyes. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I know. Eleanor reached across the small table and gently took Emma's hand. That's exactly why you did. The room remained silent, even several board members standing near the back of the office lowered their eyes. Many of them had wondered why Daniel insisted on interviewing an unknown waitress. Now they understood. One of the directors spoke quietly. Mrs. Ashford, I've served on this board for 11 years. She smiled. I know. I've never seen you recommend anyone. I've never met anyone who reminded me so much of your father. Daniel looked toward his mother. Emotion briefly crossed his face. She smiled warmly. Your father used to say something. She looked back at Emma. You can teach someone how to manage money. You can teach someone how to run a company. But you cannot teach a heart to care after it has spent years learning not to. Daniel nodded. I've never forgotten those words. Emma wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Eleanor replied. But Emma couldn't remain silent. I keep thinking, she smiled nervously through tears. If I'd taken the bus that morning, if I'd walked past the bakery, if I'd kept those $3, her voice broke. None of this would have happened. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently. My dear, she smiled with quiet certainty. It was never about $3. Emma looked into her eyes. It was about the choice. Daniel slowly returned to his seat. The interview was never about your hospitality experience. It was never about your education. It wasn't even about whether you could manage a foundation. He looked directly at her. It was about discovering whether your heart could be purchased. Emma frowned. My heart. He nodded. Power changes people. Wealth changes people. Recognition changes people. But kindness, he smiled. True kindness remains the same whether someone is watching or not. Emma's tears finally escaped, she laughed softly through them. I've spent my whole life thinking I had nothing valuable to offer. Daniel shook his head. You've been carrying the one thing money cannot buy. Eleanor smiled, her eyes shining with quiet pride. A beautiful heart. For the first time since entering the building, Emma understood why every strange question had been asked, why the interview felt different, why no one seemed interested in her resume, why a billionaire's company had invited an unknown waitress through its front doors. The greatest mystery of the past week had finally been answered, but as Emma looked at Daniel and Eleanor, she had no idea that the most life-changing moment of her journey had not yet arrived. For several moments, no one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that follows a truth powerful enough to leave everyone searching for the right words. Emma lowered her eyes, still trying to understand how one ordinary morning had led her here. She thought about the long walks to work, the unpaid bills waiting at home, the nights spent wondering whether she could keep her family together. Never, not even once, had she imagined that buying a loaf of bread would bring her into the office of one of the most influential people in the country. Daniel finally broke the silence. Emma, he reached for a simple blue folder resting on the table. I'd like to offer you something. Emma looked up nervously. I appreciate that, but I don't want charity. Daniel smiled. I'm relieved to hear you say that. He slid the folder across the table. This isn't charity. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a neatly prepared employment agreement. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. Community Outreach Leadership Program, Executive Training Fellowship, Ashford Foundation. She stopped reading. I think, she looked up uncertainly. You've handed me the wrong file. Daniel shook his head. I haven't. But this says, her voice almost disappeared. Leadership. It does. Emma stared at him. You want me to become a manager? Daniel smiled gently. No. He paused. I want you to become a leader. She gave a nervous laugh. Those aren't the same thing. Not always. He leaned forward slightly. A manager can organize schedules. A leader changes lives. Emma looked back at the folder. I've never led anything. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Really? She nodded. I've only been a waitress. Eleanor smiled warmly. My dear, you've been leading much longer than you realize. Emma frowned. I don't understand. You've been leading your family. Eleanor said softly. You've been leading frightened children back to smiles. You've been leading hungry animals toward kindness. You've been leading strangers toward hope without ever asking them to remember your name. Emma blinked as fresh tears gathered in her eyes. I wasn't leading. You were serving. Daniel nodded. And the finest leaders I've ever known, he smiled. Never stopped serving. Emma looked down again, the words touched something deep inside her, yet fear quickly followed. This company employs thousands of people. It does. I've never even finished college. I know. I don't understand financial reports. You'll learn. I've never attended executive meetings. You'll attend many. Emma shook her head. What if I fail? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward one of the bookshelves that he picked up a framed photograph that showed a much younger man wearing work boots, standing proudly beside a small construction site. My father. Daniel smiled. The founder of this company. Emma studied the picture. He never went to university. She looked surprised. He didn't. Daniel shook his head. He left school at 16 to support his family. He learned business by making mistakes. He learned leadership by keeping his word. Daniel gently placed the photograph back on the shelf. The people who underestimated him saw what he lacked. My mother saw what he carried. Eleanor's eyes glistened with memory. He possessed something that couldn't be printed on a diploma. Emma smiled faintly. Character. Eleanor nodded proudly. Exactly. Daniel returned to his chair. We can teach accounting. We can teach public speaking. We can teach negotiation. We can teach management. He looked directly into Emma's eyes. But no classroom has ever discovered how to teach someone to genuinely care about people. Emma quietly absorbed every word. Daniel continued. The position isn't immediate. She looked up. It isn't. No. He smiled reassuringly. For the next 12 months, you'll receive professional training. You'll work alongside experienced mentors. You'll study leadership, finance, hospitality, and nonprofit management. You'll visit every community program we support. You'll ask questions. You'll make mistakes. You'll grow. Emma looked relieved. So you don't expect me to know everything? Daniel laughed. I've been CEO for 15 years. I still don't know everything. Even the board members smiled. The tension in the room softened. Emma slowly closed the folder. I don't know if I'm the right person. Daniel answered almost immediately. That sentence alone tells me you are. She looked puzzled. The people most desperate for power, he said quietly, are rarely the people who should hold it. Eleanor reached over and gently placed both hands around Emma's. My dear, when I first met you, I saw someone who believed she had very little. She smiled with grandmotherly warmth. But I saw someone who already possessed everything we were searching for. Emma's voice trembled. I'm afraid. I know. Eleanor squeezed her hands gently. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to walk forward while carrying it. Emma took a slow breath. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked like an endless hallway filled with unpaid bills and impossible choices. It looked uncertain, but hopeful. Daniel slid a fountain pen across the table. There is no pressure. You may take the agreement home. Discuss it with your family. If your answer is no. He smiled sincerely. Our respect for you will remain exactly the same. Emma looked at him in surprise. You'd still respect me? Absolutely. We didn't bring you here to buy your loyalty. We brought you here because you already earned our admiration. Those words settled deeply inside her heart. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, not because of what she owned, not because of what she had accomplished, but because of who she was. Emma picked up the pen, her hand trembled slightly. She wasn't signing away her future, she was opening the door to one she had never believed could exist. As she carefully wrote her name across the final page, Daniel and Eleanor exchanged a quiet glance, neither celebrated, neither applauded, because this wasn't the ending of Emma's story. It was the beginning of a chapter she had unknowingly started, the moment she chose a stranger's hunger over her own comfort. 6 months passed, winter slowly surrendered to spring, and the city that had once seemed cold and unforgiving began to bloom with color. Life looked different for Emma, not because she had become rich, not because she had forgotten where she came from, but because she finally had the opportunity to solve the kinds of problems she had spent years quietly enduring. Every morning, she still arrived before everyone else. The only difference was that instead of tying on a restaurant apron, she now walked through the doors of the Ashford Foundation carrying a notebook filled with ideas. She listened more than she spoke. She visited shelters before attending board meetings. She spent afternoons talking with struggling parents, exhausted nurses, elderly veterans, restaurant workers, and homeless families. Whenever someone suggested another expensive fundraising gala, Emma always asked the same simple question. How many meals could we serve instead? Gradually, people stopped seeing her as the young waitress who had been given a chance. They began seeing her as the leader who never forgot why the chance had been given. One by one, her ideas became reality. Neighborhood cafes partnered with the foundation so unused meals reached hungry families instead of dumpsters. Emergency grocery vouchers were delivered within hours instead of weeks. Hospital hospitality teams were trained to care not only for patients, but for frightened relatives sleeping in waiting rooms. Ashford Global also created an employee assistance program for workers facing sudden hardship. Daniel watched each project grow with quiet satisfaction. More than once, board members asked where Emma found so many practical ideas that he always smiled. She learned them long before she entered this building. At home, life changed too. Her father's treatment improved because they could finally afford the care he needed. His cough became less frequent. Lily never again had to pretend she didn't need new school supplies, yet despite everything that had changed, Emma herself seemed remarkably unchanged. She still thanked the cleaning staff by name, she still carried extra sandwiches in her bag. She still stayed behind after meetings to help stack chairs when everyone else had already left. One afternoon, after visiting a newly opened community kitchen funded by the foundation, Emma decided to walk home instead of taking the company car. The familiar streets reminded her of the woman she used to be. As she passed a small neighborhood bakery, she noticed raised voices drifting through the open door. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Inside, a young father stood at the counter with his little daughter beside him. The girl couldn't have been older than 6. That she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest while staring hopefully at a warm loaf of bread. The cashier looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir. You're $2 short." The man searched every pocket he had. Nothing. His shoulders slowly sank. "It's all right." He forced a smile for his daughter. "We'll come back another day." The little girl nodded bravely, though disappointment filled her eyes. Emma stood quietly near the doorway. The scene felt strangely familiar. She reached into her purse. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "I've got it." The father turned immediately. "Oh, no. I couldn't ask you to, you didn't." Emma smiled. She placed the money on the counter. The cashier handed over the warm loaf. The little girl hugged it as though it were the greatest treasure in the world. "Thank you," the father said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't even know your name." Emma smiled exactly as she had months before. "You don't need to." She turned toward the door. Before stepping outside, she looked back one last time. The little girl was already smiling. That was enough. Across the street, beneath the gentle shade of a flowering tree, Eleanor Ashford watched quietly from a park bench. She had seen everything, just as she had on that cold winter morning. Emma never noticed her. She simply continued walking down the sidewalk with the same humble stride she had always possessed. Eleanor smiled to herself. Some people changed when life became easier. Emma had simply found more ways to remain kind. Daniel, who had quietly joined his mother a few moments earlier, followed Emma with his eyes until she disappeared into the afternoon crowd. "You were right," he said softly. Eleanor looked at her son. "About what?" "You said kindness wasn't an act. It was a habit." She smiled. "No," she corrected gently. "It's something even deeper than a habit." Daniel waited. "It's who she is." For a while, neither of them spoke. The city continued moving around them. Children laughed in the nearby park. Cars passed along the busy streets. Somewhere, a church bell quietly marked another passing hour. Eleanor watched the bakery door close behind the grateful father and daughter. Then she whispered the same words she had spoken months earlier. "Kindness always finds its way home." Daniel smiled. This time, he finally understood what she had meant, because one small loaf of bread had never been just a loaf of bread. That it had become warm meals for thousands of families, hope for frightened strangers, new beginnings for people who believed they had been forgotten, and a future for a young waitress who had once thought she possessed almost nothing, only to discover that the greatest wealth she carried had always been hidden within her own heart. Perhaps that is how the world changes, not through grand speeches or extraordinary miracles, but through ordinary people making extraordinary choices when no one expects them to, because every act of genuine kindness begins as something small. A few coins, a helping hand, a warm meal, a moment of compassion. Yet those small choices have a remarkable way of traveling farther than we ever imagine, touching lives we may never meet and opening doors we never knew existed. And somewhere, perhaps sooner than we expect, kindness always finds its way home.